You are listening to the Oddities of Violence podcast, a podcast about ideas and events from the margins of terrorism, genocide, and the philosophy of violence. This podcast is recorded at the CJSW 90.9 FM studios at the University of Calgary in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, located on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, which is comprised of the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Your hosts are Gavin Cameron, Josh Goldstein, and Maureen Hebert. We're all on faculty here in the Department of Political Science. Just a caution before we get started, this podcast is for a mature audience and deals with topics, commentary, and depictions of events that some listeners may find difficult or distressing. Hello everyone, welcome to the Oddities of Violence podcast. I'm your host for today, Gavin Cameron. I'm joined as usual by my co-hosts, Maureen Hebert. Hi Maureen.
Hi Gavin.
And Josh Goldstein. Hi Josh.
Hi Gavin. Hi Maureen.
In this episode, we're probing the margins of terrorism. We'll be having a conversation about Jewish terrorism against the Nazis in pre-Second World War Europe. Joining us today is one of our Oddities of Violence workshop contributors, Dr. Or Honig. We're talking to him an ocean away as he's in Tel Aviv, Israel. Hi, Or.
Hi, it's a pleasure, Gavin. And hi, Maureen, and hi, Josh.
Hi,
Hi, Or.
Or is currently an associate professor of international relations at Tokyo International University. Prior to that, he held positions at Duke University and at Tel Aviv University, in both cases in the political science departments. His research has dealt with a variety of issues related to terrorism and counterterrorism, such as terrorist propaganda and evidence fabrication, terrorists' rationality, lynching attacks, strategic assassinations, deterrence against terrorism, and coercion designed to stop terrorism. He has also written on Israeli and American security policies, especially in the Middle East context. As part of his research on the Middle East, he investigated issues such as regime survival after crushing military defeats and subversion tactics to take over other states without using military means. He finished his PhD in political science at UCLA and later did his postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Military and Strategic Studies at the University of Calgary. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty of your argument, I'd like to take a step back and get a sense of your academic origin story. How did you become interested in your broader research focus in terrorism and more specifically the theme for today?
Okay, so there are two questions here, right? So with regards to terrorism in general, I remember the days of the Al-Aqsa Intifada. There were suicide attacks in Jerusalem. And I was taking buses. I was serving in the army, but I was in the headquarters in Tel Aviv. I was taking buses all the way to the Hebrew University. And I experienced fear and saw fear in people's eyes. It's something it cannot escape you, the fear in people's eyes. I had my small pistol in case the terrorist comes along. But the point is that once I reached the halls of academia, I entered the Hebrew University, they were talking about peace studies and conflict resolution and diplomacy. And I said, you're so disconnected from what's going on right now here. And it felt frustrating. It really felt frustrating. And I wanted to better understand terrorism. It affected our lives, really, to a great extent. So that's with regards to terrorism in general. Now, what's going on here in this case is that there's something counterintuitive about terrorism and genocide. If you can use terrorism to prevent genocide, shouldn't you use it? Genocide is the most horrible thing that can happen in terms of human rights. We all have a liberal agenda and believe in limiting the suffering of people or the number of people being killed. Well, I know it's utilitarian philosophy rather than liberal philosophy, but shouldn't we support terrorism to prevent genocide, if it does prevent genocide? And that's one thing that really appealed to me because it's counterintuitive. And the other one is that we have here two individuals, actually three, because the Ukrainian case is less well known, but it's actually a mini genocide. 100 to 50,000 to 200,000 people died there. And again, you have acts of terrorism that are related to the prevention of genocide. It just made me more morally confused about right versus wrong. So I like that topic. I like to be confused.
Well, it's fortunate that you went into academia then. So, I mean, you very nicely sort of brought up some of the issues at play within the case study that you're going to present at the workshop. And as you've suggested, you're basically arguing about whether terrorism is an inherently illegitimate tactic, and also about the strategic choices associated with particular forms of violence. So why one might commit a particular type of violence. Before we get going, however, on sort of those wider implications, can you just give us a very quick overview of the 2-3 cases that you've already alluded to? Just give us a quick taster of what we're talking about.
Thanks, Kevin. So we're talking about 3 cases, and I deliberately chose 3. Look, we have only, before the establishment of Israel, and if we ignore Zionist terrorism in Palestine for a moment or related to Israel, we have only 5 cases of Jewish assassinations or attempted assassinations, Jews using violence. Now, of course, you might say the whole Jewish history is full of atrocities. Why are they not revenging? Why are they not using violence? And I will answer that in a moment. But so the 3 main cases that are related, that their goal was to prevent future violence, not just to revenge acts of violence, are first of all the 2 against the Nazis. One is David Frankfurter, a Croatian Jew who lived in Switzerland and who killed the head of the Nazi party in Switzerland, thus helping eventually that Switzerland would not fall into the hands of the Nazis via means of subversion, the way that Austria did, right? So he saved 20,000, helped save 20,000 Jews who lived in Switzerland. Good for him. And the second case, that was in 1936, just before the Olympics that Hitler hosted, and so there was no retaliation. The second case is very well known. It's Herschel Greenspan, a 70-year-old Jewish, no longer a student, a Jew who's living in Paris without any permits, and who kills the third secretary, Ernst von Raff, in the German embassy in Paris. And that triggered, of course, Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glasses, which was a turning point in German policy towards the Jews. And these are the 2 main cases. The third case I thought belongs to this category, because here we have a case of a Jew both avenging a genocide as well as thinking forwards. And that's Shulem Schwarzbard, a Jew from Ukraine, who was 40-something-year-old, a watchmaker living in Paris. And one day he hears that the leader of independent Ukraine, called Simon Petliura, it has arrived and living in Paris. So he takes a gun and simply goes and shoots him in the street. And it's a fascinating case, not well known, because before the Holocaust, Simon Petliura was the closest thing to a Hitler. The Ukrainian genocide, as I mentioned before, led to the death of around 50 to 200,000 Jews. As part of the Russian Civil War. Do you want some historical background on that? It's very interesting. So essentially, yeah, go ahead, Kevin.
I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, just some very quick background would be great.
Right. So, okay, so this is what's going on. The Russian Empire was very big, and it encompassed areas of Ukraine and Poland as well. As soon as it collapses, we have a struggle between the White Army, which is monarchist and want to reestablish the Tsar and so on, versus the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks, now, in addition, they lose in Russia, the White Army, but as soon as the Bolsheviks take over Russia, Trotsky and Lenin say we need to take over Ukraine and Poland so we can export communism into Central Europe and Western Europe, of course. And they try to do that. And we have the very famous Polish-Russian war between Joseph Pigluski against Trotsky and Lenin. But the truth is that he had a Ukrainian partner, and that was Simon Petliura. Okay, now how is that related to the Jews at all? Some background: most Jews always, when they use violence, they join existing undergrounds. They don't self-identify as Jews. So of course there were many Jews inside the Bolshevik movement. But the Ukrainian Jews were not Bolshevik. They just sided with whoever used least violence. And that happened to be the Bolsheviks because they're very international, they're less racist. I would even say communists are not racist. They're multi-ethnic, they look at class struggle and so on. Whereas Petliura and Ukrainian nationalism at that time believed in pure Ukraine, right? Without Poles, Jews, and so on. But also the Jews sided with the Bolsheviks, and so the volunteer army, that was the army of the Ukrainians, started killing Jews as part of the attempt to kill anyone who's identified as Bolshevik, right? So it's in the context of a civil war. The Jews have no choice. The Jews come to Petliura and say to him, "Please stop. Please tell your army to stop killing us." And he says, "I will not let you come between the army, the volunteer army, and me." Okay, he's basically unwilling to do anything. He's unwilling to stop pogroms. In one city, he's even seeing a pogrom and does nothing. Is maybe a weak leader, maybe anti-Semite leader. I'm not going into his motives, but essentially he did not stop the genocide taking place under his watch with his army. He let it happen. But it's part of the Bolshevik versus nationalist forces, right? I hope it's clear. If not, I can explain again.
No, I think that was pretty clear, all. Thank you. If we can turn now to the sort of wider implications of these three cases. When we talk about terrorism, a lot of the standard accounts do assume that terrorism as a tactic is inherently illegitimate. And one of the reasons that the standard literature makes that argument is that it's indiscriminate. And we can absolutely take issue with whether that's actually true, because there's all sorts of planning and tactical choices that are going to change whether something is truly random or indiscriminate. But what you're talking about here is a series of assassinations, so that's even more specific. So how would the standard account of terrorism that you're looking to challenge here, how would the standard account of terrorism delegitimize assassinations of individuals? And why do you think that account shouldn't apply in this case? Is it a greater good argument that you're making? And you alluded to that already earlier in our talk.
So I want to give an example. Maybe I'll repeat some of the things I said.
Yes, please.
Liberals believe in a world governed by rules. They want to transition to a world governed by rules. They condemn violence which is not for self-defense. And even though some people should pay a price and be punished for their misdeeds, they believe that should be found out in a court of law. And the procedures of justice must be kept. So there is a procedural aspect to liberalism as well, to criminal law. Notion of why terrorism is bad. Terrorism is bad because the person perpetrating terrorism doesn't know that the person that he's going to kill is really guilty or not. He's working based on hearsay. He doesn't know what that person is really behind the scene. He's acting based on the perception that he has of that person, not on facts. Unlike a government. So that's why terrorism is considered always bad. I have a problem with that notion, because if we wait to the legal system to work, history would go in the wrong direction. We all know that law scholars are great, but they don't deal with the real world sometimes. And in order to change history in the right directions, sometimes you need to take law into your own hands. This is so completely anti-liberal, right? You need to take law into your own hands if you want to change history in the right direction. Even for the liberal cause of saving lives. And that's why I see a contradiction. That's why I see liberalism not confronting the problem of the forces of history. That's where terrorists get it right and liberals get it wrong. Those who delegitimize terrorism get it wrong for that reason in particular. Does that make sense? Do you want me to explain or give an example? Or...
No, I understand. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with you, but that's not necessary.
Right.
So
yeah,
you've basically made an argument for terrorism as a form of necessity. You've basically made a sort of, again, a greater good or a necessity argument here. And you've basically articulated it as a form of necessary extrajudicial killing. But there are lots of forms of violence that one might look at that are not assassinations, that are not this form of violence that you've identified here. And when we look at the terrorism literature, strategic choice and sort of tactical choice is an important part of that literature. And the literature has spent a long time debating the balance between rational calculation, and some of what you're talking about is a calculation about where the greater good lies. So calculations between rational and greater good, and a range of other factors, perhaps organizational requirements, logistical imperatives. How does your case here, or cases, help us to understand the factors that lead to terrorism in specific cases?
Okay, so I'm saying in the cases that I saw, people are saying this must stop. People are dying. Regimes are too violent. We must do something to stop this, and we can do something to stop it. So it's a very empowering experience to read the history of these cases, because I believe that these cases overall did more good than bad. In the anti-Nazi cases, both Herschel Greenspan and David Frankfurter saw Jews being killed, persecuted, and they said enough is enough. We have to let the world know what is going on. We have to stop the source of violence and the source of genocide, which is coming towards us. And that's why we have to use terrorism. So unlike terrorism, which is, I would say, trying to be used for a vision, right? Let's say I have a vision to impose Sharia law in a continent of Europe. Let's say I have a vision to do ethnic cleansing in Bosnia. Let's say I have a vision to coerce the other side to make concessions in a dispute or conflict. Unlike that kind of terrorism, this kind of terrorism is born out of keen awareness of humanitarianism, right? It's humanitarian terrorism. Oh my God, this is a terrible term, but it's humanitarian because its goal is really to save lives. The people who observed genocides are saying enough is enough, or at least saw what is leading to a genocide. Enough is enough. We must put a stop to this. We must trigger some processes that will put a stop to this kind of ethnic cleansing or genocide. And that's why that makes me see terrorism in a completely new light.
Sure, and I mean that makes sense, and I don't think that actually is a particularly odd characterization of terrorists' self-understanding of what they're doing. I mean, Bruce Hoffman, for example, has argued that terrorists see themselves as intrinsically altruists. And obviously, you can take issue with whether that is objectively true, but it might be subjectively true. But I mean, I don't think that that's a sort of completely outside the bounds of fairly mainstream arguments within terrorism studies. I wonder if you can perhaps talk, and you have talked a little bit already, about the sort of wider demonstration effect, the deterrence, as you talked of it, about these acts. So we have the sort of Zionist groups in Palestine a little later than the three cases that you're describing, but we also have the revenge attacks by Nakam and various other groups in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, so sort of 1945, 1946. To what extent were the cases that you're describing influential in these slightly later sets of violence? Did they set an example? Did they inspire?
They did not inspire yet. They did inspire later on in Israel. So those three cases are actually commemorated in Israel, very much so. And I was actually surprised to the extent to which they're, Shalom Schwarzbard is called the Avenger, and there are streets in Israel called the Nokem, the Avenger. And everyone knows this is about Shalom Schwarzbard. And there are streets after David Frankfurter. And there are streets, obviously, about Herschel Greenspan. And yet, there are no streets about the Bielski brothers. There are no streets named after partisans who engage in self-defense. Why? Because Zionism is about Jews finally taking weapons and acting like a nation. In that sense, and also avenging. And in that sense, because these were the heroes of Zionism, we can definitely see the state of Israel or Mossad using violence as part of this tradition whereby Jewish blood is not going to be cheap, right? And those who killed should pay the price. So, for instance, when Mossad is killing the Nazi criminal, Nazi genocidaire Herbert Zuckers in Uruguay, they're doing it as part of that tradition of Shalom Schwarzbard or others. We have to take, sometimes we have to use violence and not just bring Eichmann to trial, but actually to kill people. Why? Even though Zuckers was not a threat, obviously. He was old, he was a Nazi, he was living in Latin America, he was not a threat. But this is about revenge. Jews returning to history, namely becoming Zionist, is about revenge. And the state of Israel commemorates these three people precisely because they took action. Precisely because they said one day, I care about my people, therefore I must act. Now, forgive me for being biblical for a second. Moses does that. Moses look at his people being enslaved and treated harshly, and he does the wonderful thing of killing the slave driver. He does it out of empathy, right? That's why he's the hero of the Jewish people. He has empathy. And so he's a good terrorist. He's a good terrorist who feels empathy. But he doesn't even seek glory. He buries the body, which is only empathy. Which is why Moses is considered such a hero. But I think that this Moses always troubled me as a figure. I don't want to go there, but I think that these three people were celebrated or commemorated in Israel because the notion of taking action when you see someone wanting to kill you is logical. It was an antidote to the Jewish reaction for generations, whereby you lower your head, you let the atrocity take place, and you wait for better times, for a better czar or a better ruler, or for Cromwell to come along in England. That's kind of the Jewish tradition, and so it's an antidote, right? So in that sense, it influenced Zionists, but it did not influence the specific revenge taking place after the Second World War. That specific revenge did not need these cases. There was an imperative to revenge. People felt a need to revenge. And by the way, we know of the cases where the Jewish Brigade did that with a lot of with the British turning a blind eye. In the Soviet Union, it was even more direct. The Soviets actually told the Jewish person, here, you see this house? This is where a Nazi lives. Go take this weapon. I'm giving you a weapon. Please go and kill him. So the Soviet Union believed in revenge much more than the British. The British just turned a blind eye, or the Americans sometimes gave intelligence to the Jewish Brigade to kill a Nazi. But it's much more elaborate in the Soviet Union, this kind of natural justice, right? Without any court, without any judicial procedure. I hope I answered that question.
Yes, no, that was great, Or. Thank you.
They did not inspire.
Okay, thank you. And I think at this point, I will turn the questions over to Maureen to perhaps ask some questions about some of the historical specifics and their implications.
Absolutely. So this has been a really interesting discussion. And what I think is so interesting about your approach is that you're taking the two forms of violence in this project and putting them together. So it's the terrorism and the genocide piece. You make an interesting observation in your claim that the three cases that you're looking at, or at least the two Nazi ones, are in part about genocide prevention, right? That you've said that they kind of see this onslaught against the Jewish people in Europe coming down the road. And this is a kind of interesting way of thinking about genocide prevention, because usually, or at least now, since the creation of the UN Genocide Convention in 1948, we think that genocide prevention is something that only states do. So this is a kind of interesting way of thinking about it. But I do want to challenge you just a little bit, or maybe you can comment, maybe challenge is too harsh a way of putting it, just the kind of timeline of things. So we know in Holocaust and genocide studies, which is my area of expertise, from very extensive archival research done since the opening of the Soviet archives in the early 1990s, that the Nazi regime's decision to exterminate the Jews did not happen until sometime during either the summer or early fall of 1941, following the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. So is it the case that you're sort of thinking about these assassins as engaging in genocide prevention as a scholar with the benefit of hindsight, or is there evidence from, say, their diaries or, the historical materials you're looking at, that they somehow saw the emergence of a genocidal policy that even the Nazis themselves had not decided on in the 1930s?
Okay, so that's a comment about Hitler and my thinking about what's going on in the mind of Hitler. And then I'll come back to your question about, our knowledge about when the decisions were made. So Hitler believes that the only way to defeat the Allies and the Soviet Union in December of 41, this is only after I think it's even after Stalingrad. It's when he starts losing. And so he has to, there are two things that are going on in his mind. First of all, I think he wants to leave a legacy of a better world, a world without Jews. He believes Jews are an evil force, so he wants to leave behind a better world. That's what he says in his will, right?
Right.
But I also think that he has conspiracy thinking, and he believes that if he kills the Jews, then America will not be interested so much in being involved in this war, because obviously the Jews are driving America. And the same with the Soviet Union. The Jews are driving the Soviet Union. So killing the Jews is killing the evil force behind those who want to strangle Germany. So conspiracy thinking kind of leads him to kill Jews also for the national interest, not just for a better world. Now, how did these terrorists know that genocide is coming? We have instances of killings, but the truth is that I'm going to first of all, they have a sense of history. I want to just quote for a second Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill says, as soon as the Nazis come to power in January of 1933, I'm afraid not just for the lives of Jews in Germany, but for the lives in the whole of Europe. Now, we know that Hitler said what he said in Mein Kampf. We also know that only in January 39, he talks about Vernichtung, right? Elimination of all the Jews in Europe, only in January 39. But even before that, if you look at Julius Streicher and Der Sturmer, you see where the regime is going. Now, it's true that the killing or the genocidal policies began much later. But with the benefit of hindsight, looking at history, and remember, these people have a sense of history, every time anti-Semitism is growing, we're going to have pogroms. Anti-Semitism is growing, we're going to have pogroms. It's kind of something that repeats itself as a Jew again and again and again and again. You feel the sense of anti-Semitism growing, and soon enough, it's going to be a pogrom. We don't know how many are going to die, but we know people are going to die, right? At best, we're going to be expelled.
Right.
You know that,
yeah,
because you have a sense of history. And David Frankfurter actually talks about that exactly. He talks about it in his article and commentary, that he sensed things are going in that direction. So I don't think it's rationalizing. I really think it's a sense of, we see the Jews are being treated like subhuman. That's what Herschel Greenspan is saying. And so we know next step could be genocide or mass atrocity. We're not talking about only 50 people being killed. We're talking about tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. It's a sense of history, and also a sense of a fear that this might happen. And even if you don't know it's going to happen, it's a real risk that it's going to happen. And for them, that justifies using violence. So I agree with you. You can never forecast history, and they cannot forecast history. But they will say there's a real risk that this might happen, and therefore I must use violence to prevent it from happening, to reduce the forces that are pushing in that direction, right? Precisely because history is plastic and it may turn in a different direction, my action can make a difference.
Interesting.
Hence another legitimation for terrorism, of course.
So did they have...
By the way, I have a problem with assassination being branded as terrorism. I always had a problem with that. I think that assassination is not the killing of innocent people. I think that once you decide to be part of the Nazi machine or Putin machine today, you are no longer innocent. Even if you're a diplomat, you're no longer innocent. You're not a civilian. You have a choice to be a civilian. That would make it pure terrorism. But assassinating someone in a regime that engages in persecution or wanton killing of civilians, you are no longer innocent. You chose to be part of that regime.
This sort of brings me to my next question then. So you weigh into some fraught, very interesting territory of how Europe's Jewish communities responded as a larger community to the emerging and then manifest threats posed by the Nazis. So, the period of persecution, as Friedlander calls it, and then later the period of extermination, as he calls it. And then you say that your three cases, these three assassins, that they show a greater strategic sense than the rest of the Jewish community. So maybe you could say for our audience, what were the strategic calculations of Jewish communities around Europe? And of course, this is a very large number of people in the East, the South, in the West. They're living in all sorts of different circumstances. And of course, there's all sorts of different political inclinations, Bundists, Zionists, all that kind of stuff. But could you say a little bit about what Jewish communities were thinking, especially in the later 30s, then into the 1940s as the Holocaust began? And the kind of strategic sense they had, and how they how this kind of strategic sense is faulty relative to the three assassins that you're talking about.
So they followed the good old pattern of believing that we're vulnerable communities, use of terrorism would lead to retribution, and we're too vulnerable. We're just too vulnerable. We cannot even defend ourselves. So lowering our head, in cases where we cannot emigrate elsewhere, and they did emigrate.
Right.
They tried to emigrate to Palestine. They tried to emigrate to Latin America. And that's why we had, efforts by everyone to allow them immigration. But in cases where you cannot emigrate, acts of violence will only lead to retribution by the regime that you cannot defend yourself from. So the best you can do is sometimes lower your head, accept that this is your destiny, to suffer a bit, and wait for a better ruler, right? And that has worked for generations. It literally worked for generations. So why stop now? What's new about the Nazis? That was the common sense. In fact, the father of David Frankfurter tells him, why did you have to do it? Why did you have to kill the head of the Nazi party in Switzerland? And of course, Frankfurter changed history. He helped change history. He made sure that the Nazis would not have their fifth column inside Switzerland, that they would not take over Switzerland the way they took over Austria and subversion. For me, he understood history.
So it's an interesting...
They cannot play games. The rabbis cannot play games, but also I must say there's something beyond strategic calculation. We have to bear in mind that the Jewish communities abhorred violence. These are communities governed informally, sometimes by the women of the community, right? Men are not allowed to engage in agriculture or fighting or being a soldier. Women are very dominant. Women don't like violence. And they don't. I'm sorry. I'm saying something blunt. They look 2 steps ahead. They're afraid of the consequences, so they don't like violence. It seems too emotional, too rash. Let's hold it. Let's wait for better days, and so on. Very cautious communities, too cautious. And Frankfurter said, no, history is changing, and I must shape history in the right direction.
One of the things you suggest is that these assassinations happened in part to attract attention of the persecution of the Jews, in the 1930s and the interwar period. Could you say a little bit about what the international reaction actually was to these assassinations, and did they, succeed in effectively ringing the alarm bells? Our usual narrative of the interwar period is, as things become worse and worse for Germany's Jews and then for the larger community, is that the international response is woefully inadequate, to put it politely.
Right. And you raise a very important question. How is this terrorism actually effective in preventing genocide? So we talked about David Frankfurter engaging in counter-subversion, right? He kills the head of the Nazi party in order to prevent Nazi takeover via subversion. Makes a lot of sense. But both Frankfurter and Herschel Greenspan were thinking about, and also, by the way, Shalom Schwarzbart, we're thinking about dramatizing the plight of the Jews and bringing it to world consciousness, right? That was the issue. And it did work. It did work very much in Kristallnacht. I went exactly into this issue of what were the diplomatic responses to both Kristallnacht and to the assassination of the head of the Nazi party, Wilhelm Gustloff. Because looking at the diplomatic responses is amazing. The German ambassador let me start with Britain. Churchill didn't need much persuasion. He knew that this regime, but it was added evidence for him, just more and more evidence for him that this regime is just uncivilized, right? He says I love one of his speeches that he explained to the British people why we're declaring war. It's to fight over civilization. This is about civilization. Why? Because these are people who don't belong to civilization, and we cannot coexist with them. So for him, these cases of pogroms that the assassinations triggered did cause more attention. Kristallnacht led to a lot of diplomatic response, to the point where a German ambassador, I forgot whether it's London or Washington, said the Munich Agreement is in risk. There were condemnations from everyone. It's true that Chamberlain said that I don't care much for the Jews. He said it to his sister, but he also said, Neville Chamberlain, that these are barbarities. These are things which are not done. Dorothy Thompson was an American journalist, and um, she was Emily. You probably remember the Emily Hobhouse from the Boer War, who made a difference in the Boer War. She's the Emily Hobhouse of the Second World War. She starts to ring the alarm bells. Now it's a process. We know that the U.S. is always consumed with itself first and foremost. So it's a process. First of all, she triggers the Jewish community into action, and then more and more allies. I think she does a terrific work, and it wouldn't have been happening had there not been Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht is interesting because what is terrorism? Terrorism a lot of times is a spectacle, right? 9/11, a spectacle, big spectacle. Goebbels says, I'm going to out-spectacle the spectacle, right? I'm going to do another spectacle. But that shows your barbarity. That shows you're more terrorist than the other side. By the way, he had to do it. I can go into Goebbels' considerations. I can really go into what's going on there and why it led to Kristallnacht.
I think if you could do that in a kind of short few sentences, that would be very helpful.
Okay, so the Munich Agreement... Sorry, first of all, Ribbentrop-Molotov was a problem. Ribbentrop-Molotov, as well as the Munich Agreement, were a big problem. They showed, we're talking here, I think August is Munich. They showed that Nazism is not true to its word, that Hitler is not really as ideological as he should be, right? And Goebbels understands that Hitler needs to prove himself to the party as being very ideological, because in foreign policy he became, like a normal politician, not a true revolutionary who would build a German empire, signing agreement like Munich and so on, the Munich Agreement. So he understood his plight, his plight within party members, and he says to Hitler, "Don't worry, I'll arrange for you an event that will not shed bad light on you, but at the same time will prove your loyalty to the party, your loyalty to the ideology, because that's what party members expect of you." Now, why does Goebbels do that? Goebbels has to prove himself again. He has been caught with his affair with a Czech mistress, who was, of course, one of his actresses in his movies. He's the head of propaganda, and he lost favor. He just lost favor with Hitler. And, it's a competition of winning favor with a dictator. It's a very tough competition. And he has to win that competition again. So he orchestrates the whole event. Of course, Heydrich is very useful, but it's Goebbels' idea. It's really Goebbels' idea. And Ian Kershaw goes into that, by the way, in his wonderful passages.
That's right. Yeah.
So that's something that, I'm sorry. The diplomatic responses are just amazing. You can see so many heads of states understanding truly the nature of the Nazi regime, thanks to Kristallnacht. So Kristallnacht, in a way, and by the way, and a lot of Jews emigrated after Kristallnacht.
That's right.
Some of my family emigrated to Palestine after Kristallnacht. So it was useful in so many ways in limiting the scale of the Holocaust. And yes, a lot of times a regime, especially a dictatorship, has to respond with vengeance to a terror attack. But that very vengeance is exactly what the terrorist wants to showcase to the world, and maybe even to his own community, who's stupid enough not to understand the true nature of the regime. So wonderful, Herschel Greenspan. You saved so many Jews, so many lives. It's amazing.
Great, Or. It's been a really wonderful conversation so far. And I want to return to an idea that you keep on orbiting around, a really important one, this idea of the historical sensibility of these Jewish assassins and the way that this historic sensibility, you say, provides them with a kind of openness to the way that the future can go terribly, terribly wrong. And so instead of looking forward, I want to ask you two questions about how these Jewish assassins that you study looked backward. And one question has to deal with the history of violence that surrounds these cases. And for those who don't study terrorism, or maybe who aren't as familiar with the late 19th century, early 20th century in Europe, might not realize how extensive violence against heads of state or near heads of state was at this time between, say, the 1860s and 1930s. By one count, we can identify almost 60 significant events of assassination or attempted assassination that are directed at individuals at the highest level of the state. For instance, the Tsar of Russia, the Kaiser of Germany, the King of Italy, the President of France, the Empress of Austria-Hungary, 2 U.S. presidents, the King of Belgium, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the King of Spain, 2 Spanish prime ministers, the King of Greece. It's almost astonishing, and that's just naming individuals at the highest level in this period. So, can you tell us a little bit about how the assassinations that you study fit within this long tradition in Europe and a little bit in North America? And speaking about the assassins in particular, what evidence did they leave us of their own thinking about how they fit within this violent tradition?
These are great questions. Can you hear me well? Because I can see the line is really bad for some reason.
Oh, yeah, you're coming through really well now.
Maybe I should restart the computer. Great. So David Rappaport would say something very simple and very correct. This is the anarchist wave, right? Of course, the anarchist wave led to assassination of President, was it McKinley? I forgot which American president.
Mm-hmm. Correct. Yeah, that's right.
Emma Goldman was blamed for it, right?
Yes.
And Emma Goldman was blamed. It's all from Russia. It's all anarchism coming out of Russia, and Emma Goldman is one of those. And Shalom Schwarzbard is influenced by anarchist ideas. They no longer accept the legitimacy of rulers if they do bad things, right? So this violence is part of anarchist wave, in the sense that we're not accepting rules, and we care about, and we take actions into our own hands. We don't just demonstrate. We're anarchists, right? We don't demonstrate. We change history, right? This is beautiful about anarchism, that they do things to change the world. They don't wait, or they don't demonstrate. They just do things, anarchists. But the difference about these 3 cases is that they actually have a sense of peoplehood. They care about Jews. They're not Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman cares about the world. There are Jews who say the best way to safeguard the life of Jews is to have a better world, right? By improving the world, and that's probably going to be Emma Goldman. And there are Jews who say, no, we need to take care of our own people. And there are Jews who say, like Benjamin Disraeli, or Jews who were loyal to the Austrian Empire, let's be big part of a big empire, and then nobody notices that we are a minority in it. Jews loved empires. They're fantastic. You're just one of many, and you're swallowed in. You're not seen as too different. So these are anarchists. They began as anarchists, but after a while they realized that they're being targeted much more than any other group. And that's why they have a greater sense of peoplehood than anarchism. At least Shalom Schwarzbard started as an anarchist. I mean, he's from Ukraine. But they're all in the margins of society. Frankfurter is a bit less than the others, but Herschel Greenspan, he's in the margins of society. He's kind of pushed into violence almost. Does that answer your question
No.
about the anarchist wave?
Right. So this idea of the propaganda of the deed, is this at the forefront of their mind, and do they consciously understand themselves within this anarchist tradition? And I guess for our listeners, what is who might be interested in following up on these cases, what is the evidence that we have of their own thinking in terms of the political commitments that they have. So do we have their diaries? Do they make public speeches? Do they belong to various organizations? And so we know how they voted. Do we have police records? Were they arrested, and records of their, say, any interrogations and so on? So you had mentioned previously the way in which the Jewish state, in a sense, appropriates these figures as part of its own project. But in terms of how these individuals thought themselves, what record do we have of their own thinking, so that we don't just appropriate them, we take them on their own terms?
That's a great question. First of all, they follow the pattern of anarchists, in a sense that they, kill, and then they rush to the police in order to be arrested and say, I did it. And then they wait for the trial. And then they make the trial into the best place to showcase their argument, right? They're not the FLN trying to kill and then run away. They're not Irgun, those organizations that are trying to use attrition to kill and run away. No, they're actually very proud of what they did because they think they did the right thing. Sounding anarchist, I know it's very anarchist in their thinking, right? I did the right thing, and therefore I'm proud of it, and therefore I want to be prosecuted. And by the way, the French court found Sholem Schwarzbard not guilty. The Swiss court decided he's guilty only to please the Nazis, but of course, as soon as the Second World War was over, they let Frankfurter go to Israel. And France had a problem because France was torn between pro-German forces and pro-British forces. And so it was very political. But in all three cases, you can see this kind of anarchist thinking. I did the right thing. I should be proud of it. And I want the message to get across to the world, right? And in fact, Herschel Greenspan almost became a celebrity. He had so many interviews. At the same time, we have their diaries, not the diaries. We have, for some of them, for Frankfurter and for Schwarzbard, we have their memoirs. Frankfurter had even interviews. He lived in Israel until 1975. He was allowed to emigrate. Schwarzbard died in South Africa. I never got to Israel. And Greenspan was killed by the Nazis, probably. So we have two sources of evidence about them. First, the trials. The problem about the trials is they say whatever serves best their cause, right? But presumably they went to the police because they want to say in the trial whatever they want to say.
Right.
In each case, they went to the police and handed their gun and said, I did it. Please now arrest me and take me to court, because they're waiting there to their trial. The second one is again, interviews. Frankfurter wrote articles. He wrote a book and an article. Schwarzbard had a diary. We know what drove them. In hindsight, maybe they will over-rationalize things and reduce the weight of emotion, of course, and show it's much more calculated and show the benefit of hindsight of truly understanding the scale of the Holocaust coming, right? You read Frankfurter in commentary, and he's saying, I knew this was Amalek coming. Of course, he couldn't have known. But I think he had he had a sense that there's persecution going on. The world has to know about it in order to stop it. And in that sense, he's a son of a rabbi, a very important rabbi in Croatia. He has a sense of responsibility to the Jewish people. By the way, for generations, Jews, there were always young people, hot-headed, who wanted to do terrorism, and always their rabbis told them, don't do it. You have to be responsible. What will happen to the rest of the community? Here terrorism took place because all these free individuals were away from their community, and so they could afford not to listen to those voices which are restraining them, the rabbis who are restraining them, the women who are restraining them from revenge. Right? There were two of them in Paris, one in Davos, but near Davos, but away from their community, and so they could be more rash. Less restrained by communal considerations.
Yeah, no, that's a really fascinating really fascinating account. And I guess I have one last question that builds on that. Is it that these three Jewish assassins, their distance from the community, does it give them the opportunity to refashion their relationship to Judaism, to the Jewish community? Or is it for them an experience of liberation? So I'm not refashioning my relationship to that community. I'm now liberated from it, and now I can do what I think is necessary to do.
I think that first of all, they feel part of the community.
Okay.
Right? But they're much more prone to act. They have a sense of, there's a reason why the state of Israel made them heroes.
Yes.
Because they have a disdain to the passivity of Jews, working through the system, always through the system, never try to raise your head, never try to be too conspicuous, never use violence, right? Always wait for a better ruler. This passivity of Judaism, they have a disdain for it, a total disdain for it. And I think the distance allows them to say, we're Jewish, we feel responsibility for the people, but we're not going to follow the Jewish manual, right? And that's why they take law into their own hands. And that's why they're so few and far between. Look, I was looking for Jewish assassinations. I found 5 instances of attempt to do so, 3 real cases. I mean, so many cases of atrocities, and yet so few actions of violence. It's, for a scholar of terrorism, this is frustrating. This is really interesting.
No, it is very, very interesting. Thank you very much, Or.
Thank you so much, Or, for joining us. It's been a great conversation, and we really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much.
Yep, thanks, Or.
Or Honig will be here at the University of Calgary on June 9th, 10th, 2023 for our Oddities of Violence workshop, made possible through funding by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. If you want to know more about Or's work, drop by or live stream the workshop. Details will be on the Oddities of Violence website. You have been listening to the Oddities of Violence podcast. Our podcast is produced and edited by Alejandra Vivas. Thanks, Alejandra. With support from the great team at CJSW. Join us for our next episode when we continue with our discussion of the oddities of violence. We will be looking at the theory of violence and claims to newness or novelty within the literature on particular types of violence, such as terrorism or genocide. Our guest then will be Marta Bashofsky from the University of Regina, and your host will be Josh Goldstein. Thanks for listening, everyone. Until next time.